While we have to wait until March 21st, Temporal Forces is already out in Japan, giving us a preview of the best new decks we can expect from the upcoming set. In this video, I'll only be covering the new archetypes with Temporal Forces. In my next video, I'll show you how well current decks are performing post-rotation. Obviously, there's room for interpretation when it comes to what's new and what's not, but the word trust is literally in my name, so you can trust me to make the right decision. And as a result, you will not question me. We begin with the new baby Roaring Moon. For 2 darkness energy, it deals 70 damage plus 10 more for each ancient card in your discard pile. Temporal Forces brings us several new ancient cards, meaning this thing is a real threat. The deck building strategy is simple. If the card says ancient on it, chuck it in. So there's 4 Roaring Moon, 4 Koraidon, 2 Fluttermane, 2 Slitherwing, 4 Professor Sada, 3 or 4 Explorer's Guidance, 3 Ancient Booster, 4 Earthen Vessel, and 1 copy of the Drums of Awakening Ace Spec, which draws you 1 card for each ancient Pokemon you have in play. Obviously, your first couple of turns will potentially be lackluster, but played correctly, you could easily find yourself doing 200 damage on turn 3 with a single prizer. I've looked at all the different versions of Baby Roaring Moon from Japan, and the consensus is the exact 60 cards are up to your personal preference. Some choose to play a copy of Roaring Moon EX for big KOs, some just go full 4/4/4 Roaring Moon Koraidon Fluttermane, some throw in a copy of Baby Great Tusk to mill 4 cards, some play Pokestop while some have Temple of Sinnoh and others have a copy of De-Evolution. Personally, I think it's great that there's room for experimentation because it means you'll never know exactly which 60 cards you're facing. If you're looking for lists in the description for these decks, you'll be sorely disappointed like when I realized For the Win doesn't have a foot cam. I'll be doing another video in March, closer to the launch of Temporal Forces with all those details which will include lists you can copy and paste into PTCGL. I just, need to know the set number of each card first. If you've ever played with, or played against Durant Mill, Baby Great Tusk is that, except arguably better. Instead of needing 4 Pokemon in play for the maximum effect, as long as you played an Ancient Supporter from your hand that turn, Great Tusk mills 4 cards, all for 2 energy. Unfortunately, after being heavily played for the first 2 days of the new format, Japanese players appear to be shying away from Great Tusk lately. While it can have 200 hit points with an Ancient Booster attached, and you can use cards like Hand Trimmer and Crushing Hammer to annoy your opponent, 4 cards milled per turn isn't always going to be enough. I know me doing math should scare you more than Gardevoir's lack of toes, but if both you and your opponent have good starts, by turn 5 or 6 they'll have taken 5 prizes while you've only milled 20 cards. The loss of Echoing Horn definitely hurts Great Tusk as well, as Erika's doesn't really fit here. Though you could try a build with Erika's, the new Lickitung, the old Mantine, and Mimikyu or Snorlax to try and put your opponent into a checkmate scenario at the end of the game. I would imagine this ends up being a bit better than Durant Mill was, but Great Tusk Mill probably isn't going to be as powerful as Snorlax Block. If you're wondering how to deal with Great Tusk post-rotation, well, it already exists. If Patrol Cap is attached to your active Pokemon, cards in your deck are protected from being discarded. And the Among Us from Silver Tempest punishes anyone running Hand Trimmer. Keeping the ancient theme going, we have Raging Bolt EX. Giraffe Raikou does 70 damage for each basic energy you discard from your Pokemon, all for a lightning and fighting energy. Getting the energy on Raging Bolt turn 1 is easy. Just attach and Professor Sada. In fact, if you do that for the full effect, it's 200 damage turn 1, though you do lose all your energy in the process. I've seen plenty of Japanese players whack off with this thing, including a build that runs Gardevoir EX, which is actually quite ingenious, but the 2 most common ones are much more straightforward. The first uses Sandy Shocks EX. Once your opponent has taken 2 prize cards, you can attach a basic fighting energy from your discard pile to Sandy Shocks. Throw in a backup attacker like Baby Koraidon or Slitherwing, and you have yourself a deck that seems like a slightly worse Roaring Moon EX. But without Path to the Peak, you never really have to worry about Sandy Shocks' ability being blocked, so it should run fairly smoothly. The build that I prefer, which also benefits greatly from no Path to the Peak, uses Palkia V-Star. The Sandy Shocks Professor Sada strategy is still there, except now you have a V-Star power that puts 3 water energy into play, offering up an extra 210 damage out of nowhere. It also gives you the ability to attack with Radiant Greninja. Both builds are still being played in Japan a week later, so expect Raging Bolt to be a thing when Temporal Forces is out next month. And now we go from ancient to future. The new Future Box archetype has seen a steady rise in play and wins this past week, and it's not hard to see why. It has both consistency and power. I imagine every turn 1 for a Future Box player is going to play out the same. You go second if possible, load up your bench with future Pokemon, then attack with the new Miraidon, which does 40 base damage and accelerates 2 energy from your deck. Thanks to Iron Crown EX though, that damage can be boosted, meaning 40 can become 60, 80, 100, or even 120 depending on how many Iron Crown are on the field. And don't forget that Future Booster adds another 20 damage on top of that. Similar to Baby Roaring Moon, Future Box is open to interpretation, though the boners of the deck will always remain the same. Basically, start with Techno Radar, Future Booster, Baby Miraidon, Iron Crown EX, and Reboot Pod, then add in whatever future Pokemon you want. The most common ones I've seen in Japan are Iron Leaves EX to deal with Charizard and Roaring Moon, Iron Hands EX because it's awesome, and Iron Valiant EX to help spread some damage counters while also being able to deal 200 plus damage with its attack. The less common future attackers are Baby Iron Hands, Iron Boulder EX, which still doesn't seem great to me even with the boost, the Dragon Miraidon EX, and the new Baby Iron Valiant, which seems kind of busted if we get a highly playable future supporter in the future. Oh, and while I'm not quite sold on it, I've seen Morty's Conviction played in a few different lists, so don't overlook it. Gouging Fire EX is later in this video because it hasn't quite seen the success in Japan that I thought it would. This thing has 230 hit points, does 260 damage, and can easily get powered up in one turn with Magma Basin and Professor Soda, but it just hasn't clicked yet. Ironically, the best partner for Gouging Fire appears to be Iron Valiant EX, allowing Gouging Fire to easily KO 280 hit point Pokemon. Honestly, I'm kind of disappointed by how boring the lists are. 55 cards are already available, with the extras just being the 3 or 4 Gouging Fire and whichever A-spec you decide to run. Then you either play Radiant Greninja to get energy in the discard pile, or Radiant Charizard to give yourself a big attacker at the end of the game. My initial thought was to play Rapidash to boost Gouging Fire's damage and get energy in the discard, but Iron Valiant EX plus the Baby Moltres, which boosts the damage basic fire Pokemon deal by 10, seem to get the job done. But yeah, Gouging Fire does not make my boss stiff. That doesn't mean I'm not going to whack off with it next month though. A card that was released in Japan 7 months ago, Scovillain EX, should be included in Temporal Forces if Pokebeach's guesstimation is correct. While it's never been a top deck in Japan, it pops up here and there in tournaments because the attack can be devastating. While it only does 140 damage, for 2 grass energy you discard a random card from your opponent's hand and the top card of their deck. Basically, it's a worse Licky Licky from Unified Minds. I'm mostly including this here for people who want to play something a little different. The build I found runs the new Dunsparce, which draws you 3 cards and shuffles itself back into your deck, as well as Radiant Charizard, De-Evolution, and Gardenia. If you get really lucky with discards, it could be something fun to whip out from time to time. Otherwise, it's a bit too underpowered to be truly competitive. And to finish up, we have a deck that hasn't really done anything in Japan, Incineroar EX with Relicanth. Even with a couple of fun abilities at its disposal, Incineroar EX appears to be a dud. Incineroar does 240 damage for as little as 1 energy, depending on how many bench Pokemon your opponent has. And if Incineroar is heavily damaged, you can take advantage of Relicanth's ability, which allows your evolved Pokemon to use any attack from its previous evolutions, provided you have the necessary energy. So Incineroar can copy Litten's attack, which does 20 damage for each damage counter on Incineroar. Even though it all seems decent on paper, the success just isn't there right now. March is going to be a crazy month for the Pokemon TCG with Temporal Forces and Rotation happening on the 21st. That's also when the 8 default free decks on PTCGL will most likely be replaced with 8 new default free decks for all of 2024, and we'll get 2 new Battle Pass free decks. We'll also have a clearer picture of which decks truly have staying power in the Temporal Forces meta, as it's still early days in Japan and much is to be decided. And who knows, maybe some new deck will come out of nowhere and dominate the meta. Stay tuned.